Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. And today we're tackling something I think is going to be pretty interesting.
Yeah, I agree. It's pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah, so we're looking at the commentary of Dr. Jose Antonio Cisneros,
Yeah.
and this is about the recent election results.
Right, the U.S. election.
Yeah, the U.S. election, exactly.
It's interesting. He recorded these two videos, and it's really kind of a window into his thinking. You know?
Yeah, and how people might be, influenced or what might be going on in their minds as they're going through this process.
Exactly. And I think what's really fascinating about this is, Dr. Cisneros, he came from Venezuela to the U.S.
Right, he fled authoritarianism.
Exactly. So he came here to escape that, and now he's looking around and saying, well, wait a minute, I'm seeing some parallels here. It's kind of unsettling, and it's like, what led him to this point?
What led him to this alarming conclusion?
Yeah, and I think the starting point really is his shock at Trump's victory. I mean, he was really expecting a KamalaHarris win.
Like, he just assumed that people would look at the candidates and choose the most qualified.
Yeah, like rationally you would think that's how it would work.
Yeah, but then it gets really interesting because he starts talking about this disconnect between the economy on a macro level and then people's actual experience.
Yeah, that's where the whole macro versus microeconomics comes in, right?
Yeah, and I think that's really key to kind of understanding his perspective because on the surface things might look okay, like, unemployment is low, GDP is growing.
Right, that's like the big picture stuff.
That's the big picture stuff. That's the macro view.
But then you zoom in and you see all these individuals, all these people who are struggling.
Right, they're not feeling it.
They're not feeling that macroeconomic strength. Yeah, and so that gap between like what's supposed to be good and what people are actually experiencing, I think that's really important.
Yeah, it's like this cognitive dissonance almost.
Totally, and he's arguing that's a big reason why people might have gone for someone who's promising a huge change.
Right, even if things weren't objectively as bad as they felt.
Exactly. It's like they're voting with their gut.
Voting with their gut.
Yeah.
Rather than, looking at all the data.
Yeah, and he makes this really interesting comparison to product marketing.
Oh, yeah, he talked about how political campaigns are kind of like advertising.
Yeah, they can either focus on the positives, highlighting the candidate's strengths and accomplishments, or
go negative.
Exactly. They can go negative and really prey on people's fears and anxieties.
And he's saying that in Trump's case, that negative approach was really, really effective.
Oh, absolutely. He was a master of that.
It was a master.
Yeah, and he specifically mentions how Trump really tapped into these anxieties about immigration, economic insecurity, even like the pace of social change.
Yeah, people feeling like things are changing too fast.
Exactly. And those fears really resonated with a lot of voters. And I think that's what drove a lot of them to vote the way they did.
Like, fear was a stronger motivator than, any kind of logical argument.
Yeah, and he doesn't just say this, in a general sense. He actually gives this really compelling example.
The Tylenol thing.
Yes, the Tylenol cyanide scare. Remember that?
Oh, yeah. I remember him talking about that. It's like, you'd think that would have completely destroyed the brand.
You'd think so, right? I mean, poison Tylenol, who's going to buy that?
But it actually ended up boosting their sales.
It's crazy, right? But it makes sense in a way because all that media attention, even though it was negative, it just kept Tylenol in everyone's minds.
So people couldn't stop thinking about Tylenol, even if it was in a bad way.
Yeah, and it kind of normalized it in a strange way. And Dr. Cisneros uses that to illustrate how that constant media presence, even if it's negative, it can really solidify a brand, or in this case, a candidate's name recognition.
And make them familiar.
Exactly, make them familiar, even appealing to the public.
Yeah, so it's almost like, even though the news was about poison Tylenol, people couldn't stop thinking about Tylenol. And he's saying that's kind of what happened with Trump.
Yeah, all those years of exposure through The Apprentice, love him or hate him, everyone knew who he was.
Everyone knew his name.
They had some image of him in their mind.
Whether they like it or not.
Exactly. And that constant presence in the media, even if it wasn't always positive, it made him a familiar figure.
Like, he already had a head start.
He did. He had a huge head start in the name recognition game.
People felt like they knew him even if that knowledge was just based on a reality TV persona.
Exactly. And Dr. Cisneros is suggesting that familiarity might have overridden any kind of rational assessment of his policies or qualifications.
It's like their gut feeling about him was stronger than any logic.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting and maybe a little bit concerning.
Yeah, because he starts talking about how even demographic groups who logically you would think would support Harris ended up voting for Trump.
Right?
Yeah.
You know, based on their economic interests or their social values.
You'd think they'd go for Harris.
You'd think so, but they didn't.
And he's saying that this just further supports his argument that emotional appeals, especially those rooted in fear, they often win out over logic.
Over rational decision-making, especially in a political climate like ours.
Which is kind of unsettling because it's like, how can we have, good debates or make responsible choices when everybody's just running on emotions?
Well, that's the thing, right? Recognizing the influence of those emotions is a huge first step.
Yeah, and that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to alert us to this power of these less than rational forces
that are at play in our political landscape.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes his perspective so valuable, because he's not just saying like, oh, Trump won and this is bad. He's actually trying to dig into the why.
Yeah, he's trying to understand the underlying dynamics.
The psychology behind it.
And that's crucial for figuring out how to move forward. You know, how to have a more productive conversation, how to make sure that we're not just constantly manipulated by these emotional appeals.
Right, because if we don't understand how it's happening, it'll just keep happening.
Exactly, and it'll just get worse and worse.
And I think that's a perfect place to pause for now, and then we'll pick this back up in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it. And it's not just these abstract fears, like he's actually worried about speaking out himself.
Yeah, he mentions that he's hesitant to voice his own dissenting opinions.
Yeah, it's like he's worried about what might happen.
Repercussions, yeah.
From the new administration and their supporters.
Which is really disturbing when you think about it. Like, this is the U.S., freedom of speech.
Exactly. It's like one of the fundamental principles of this country.
And as someone like Dr. Cisneros, who, has dedicated his life to promoting democracy, if he feels silenced.
What does that say about the state of things, right?
What does that say about the future of open discourse?
It's a chilling thought.
It is. And he makes this comparison to Venezuela.
Oh, yeah, where he talks about how the country basically committed suicide.
By chipping away at its own democratic foundations.
Yeah, it's a powerful image.
It is. And he describes how it all started, with this charismatic leader who promised to fix everything.
Yeah, appealing to people's frustrations, painting this picture of a glorious future.
That's a familiar pattern, right?
It is. We've seen it over and over again throughout history.
The rise of the populist leader.
Yeah, and Dr. Cisneros is warning us that as those anxieties grow, it becomes easier and easier to fall for these simple solutions.
To stop thinking critically.
Exactly. And he talks about how in Venezuela, those checks and balances, they just gradually eroded.
The media was suppressed. Dissent was silenced.
And all that power, it just got concentrated in the hands of a few.
Like that frog in boiling water?
Yeah. It doesn't realize the danger until it's too late.
And by then, it's really hard to reverse course.
It is. And that's what's so scary about it.
And what's really striking is how he talks about the people who initially supported the regime in Venezuela.
Right. They believed the promises, they bought into the fear-mongering.
And in the end,
they ended up worse off.
Yeah. So it's not just about abstract political theory. This is real people's lives.
Exactly. And that's why his perspective is so important. It's a call to action.
A wake-up call.
Yeah, he's urging us to be critical, to question the narratives, to be wary of those who are trying to divide us.
For their own gain.
Exactly. Because in the end, we're the ones who suffer.
So what can we do? Like, what are the signs we should be looking for?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, because it's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day and not see the bigger picture.
Right. But there are some common warning signs we should be aware of.
Like what?
Well, attacks on the free press, that's a big one.
Yeah, trying to silence the media.
Eroding judicial independence, making sure the courts are impartial.
Right, making sure the courts aren't just puppets.
Exactly, and any efforts to suppress voting rights.
Yeah, because that's the foundation of democracy.
It is. If people can't vote freely and fairly, then the whole system breaks down.
So it's not just about looking at the big abstract ideas, but also these concrete actions.
The tangible things that can really undermine democracy.
Yeah, because those are the things that can sneak up on us.
They can, and Dr. Cisneros is urging us to be aware of those historical patterns.
To see the parallels.
To take action to protect our own democracy before it's too late.
He's not saying we should panic, but we should be vigilant.
Informed vigilance.
Informed vigilance. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And going back to his own experience, it's kind of scary that he feels the need to self-censor.
Yeah, he's worried about speaking out.
And if he, who escaped oppression, feels this way.
What does that say about the current climate?
right? It's like this chilling effect on free speech.
It is, and it's not necessarily about overt censorship. It's more subtle than that.
It's like this pressure to stay silent,
To avoid rocking the boat.
even when you see something wrong.
And that silence, it can be just as damaging as any direct form of repression.
Because it allows those in power to just keep doing whatever they want.
Exactly, unchecked by dissenting voices.
Which brings us back to that question, what can we do?
How do we protect those dissenting voices?
How do we ensure that rational discourse is still possible?
Especially in this age of polarization and potential crackdowns on free speech.
It's a tough question.
It is. It can feel overwhelming.
Yeah, especially when you look at the enormity of the challenges that Dr. Cisneros is laying out.
But I think what he's trying to tell us is that we can't give in to apathy or despair.
We can't just throw up our hands and say it's hopeless.
Exactly. Our voices matter. Our actions have consequences.
And he even brings up the McCarthy era,
Oh, yeah, that dark chapter in American history.
when people were blacklisted and persecuted for their beliefs.
It's a reminder that this isn't just some ancient history.
This could happen again.
It could if we're not careful.
And it's not just about, abstract freedoms. It's about real people's lives being affected.
Exactly, and that's what makes it so important to be vigilant, to speak out against injustice.
To defend those freedoms that we often take for granted.
Because once they're gone, they're not easy to get back.
One thing that Dr. Cisneros is really concerned about is the rise of what he calls an oligarquíaCorporativa.
Yeah, this idea that a small group of corporations and wealthy individuals have way too much influence
Over the government.
over policy decisions, yeah.
And he specifically mentions Elon Musk.
Yeah, as an example of someone who already has a lot of power and influence.
And now that might be even greater given his connections to the new administration.
Exactly, and it raises this question of how do we ensure that the government is accountable to the people?
To all the people, not just to a select few.
Yeah, not just to the wealthy and powerful.
Right, because that's not what democracy is supposed to be about.
It's not. It's supposed to be about representing the interests of everyone.
And another thing that Dr. Cisneros is worried about is mass deportations.
Yeah, fueled by anti-immigrant sentiment.
Like finding a scapegoat for the nation's problems.
Exactly, blaming immigrants for everything.
Which is really dangerous and not just because of the human cost.
Right, it would have huge economic and social consequences.
And he makes a parallel to the treatment of Jewish people throughout history.
Yeah, how they've often been scapegoated during times of crisis.
It's a chilling reminder of how dangerous prejudice and discrimination can be.
And how important it is to stand up for the rights of all people.
Regardless of their background or beliefs.
Exactly, everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect.
And what's even more disturbing is that some people are already profiting from this situation.
He talks about how the stock prices of private prison companies are going up.
Because investors are anticipating a surge in demand.
It's like they're betting on human misery.
It's a really stark illustration of how greed can blind people to the human cost.
To the suffering that's involved.
And it makes you wonder, what kind of society are we creating?
When profit comes before people.
When we're willing to sacrifice basic human rights for the sake of money.
It's a sobering thought.
It is, and I think it's something we all need to grapple with.
Yeah, because if we don't, it's only going to get worse.
Dr. Cisneros paints a pretty bleak picture of the future.
He does. He sees a country that's becoming more and more divided.
With a government that only cares about the wealthy and powerful.
And ignores the needs of ordinary citizens.
Which is a vision that I think resonates with a lot of people.
It does. There's a lot of disillusionment out there.
A lot of people are searching for answers.
For some hope.
And while Dr. Cisneros doesn't sugarcoat the challenges,
he does offer a glimmer of optimism.
Yeah, he reminds us that even in the darkest of times,
the human spirit can endure.
That we need to hold on to our values.
To speak truth to power.
And to work together to create a better future.
For ourselves and for generations to come.
And one thing that really stuck with me was how he talked about becoming a U.S. citizen.
Yeah, he did it because he believed in the ideals of this country.
In freedom and democracy.
It's a reminder that citizenship is more than just a passport.
It's a commitment.
A responsibility.
So what does it mean to be a good citizen in these times?
In these uncertain times, yeah, that's a good question. It means being informed and engaged. Like actually paying attention to what's going on.
Yeah, not just burying our heads in the sand.
Exactly, and being willing to stand up for what we believe in.
Even when it's hard.
Especially when it's hard, you know, because that's when it really counts.
And maybe it also means being willing to have those tough conversations.
Yeah, with people we disagree with.
Which is something that Dr. Cisneros talks about a lot, this polarization.
Yeah, it's tearing us apart.
We've lost the ability to, have a civil conversation.
It's like it's taboo to even try to understand the other side.
But if we want to save our democracy, we got to figure out how to bridge that divide.
We have to find a way to talk to each other.
To listen to each other.
Without immediately jumping down each other's throats.
Yeah, and he also talks about the importance of supporting organizations that are fighting for civil liberties.
Right, those groups that are on the front lines defending our freedoms.
Like the ACLU.
Yeah, exactly, groups like that.
And he's urging us to get involved.
Not just by voting, but by actually doing something.
Donating, volunteering, raising awareness.
Every little bit helps.
Because it's easy to feel powerless in the face of all this.
It is, but we're not powerless.
We have a voice.
We have a choice.
And Dr. Cisneros' story is a powerful reminder of that.
It's a warning and a call to action.
Yeah, it's a reminder that democracy is precious.
And fragile.
We can't take it for granted.
We have to fight for it.
Every single day.
So let's take a step back for a second and just recap what we've learned from this deep dive into Dr. Cisneros' perspective.
Yeah, we started with his shock at Trump's victory.
Right, and how he sees that as a symptom of this disconnect between the perception of the economy and the reality.
And then we explored his analysis of how emotions, especially fear, can really drive people's decisions.
Overriding logic and reason.
And then we got into his concerns about the erosion of democratic norms.
The warning signs that he's seeing.
And his own personal fears, which are especially poignant given his experience in Venezuela.
It's a reminder that these threats are real.
And that freedom is something we have to constantly defend.
And finally, we talked about the importance of being informed citizens.
Engaging in respectful dialogue.
And taking action to protect our democracy.
So as we wrap up here, we want to leave you with a question.
Yeah, something to think about.
How can we bridge the divide between opposing viewpoints?
How can we create a space for more nuanced and respectful conversation?
How can we ensure that reason and empathy prevail?
Even in the face of fear and uncertainty.
Because the future of our democracy depends on it.
It really does. It's up to all of us.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope you found it insightful.
And we'll see you next time.